Hello, everyone. Welcome to Connecting with Ideas 101. What are the chances? So, where we left off last time, we had just talked about how memory fails. Why is it that we sometimes forget? And there were 5 main reasons that have been suggested by different researchers over millennia. One of those is decay. You forget stuff because, you haven't thought of it in a while. And that's actually a very, very common one. Repression, which is more of a Freudian thing and doesn't really apply to anything in school, so we skip over it. Distortion happens. Um, and distortion is when you remember something that didn't actually happen. Interference can happen with school. It can happen with people, right? You meet a bunch of people in the morning and then you meet a bunch of people in the evening and you get their names mixed up. And this is the same thing as when you learn about personalities in your morning history class, and then you learn about personalities in your evening sociology class, and you get their names mixed up. And then cue dependency. Sometimes we can't forget because we don't have just the right hint. We don't have just the right prompt. And we learn some way of getting around that. So next Higby, that's a review. Next Higby talks about how fast we forget. And the bad news is that we forget pretty fast. We already know that short-term memory only lasts a second or two at the most. In experiments, and of course Higby is full of footnotes and research reports, most of what we forget about something will occur shortly after we have learned it. For example, after learning a list of nonsense syllables, and this is a typical way to test raw memory, right? It would be difficult. Well, take me, for example. If you wanted me to do some experiment and, well, let's learn some foreign vocabulary words. Well, I know enough foreign vocabulary. It's not going to be a fair test. And so what they'll often do is make up these nonsense syllables, and they're typically a consonant and a vowel and a consonant. And there are actually ways you can use mnemonics to get very good at that, but the average person isn't very good at that. And so this is what they'll use as a baseline for memory research often. And after learning a list of nonsense syllables, he says I don't know if he knows you would probably forget almost half of them within 20 minutes and more than 2/3 after 2 days. And what he was saying was most you forget happens at the beginning. So this is 2 days later. A month later, your memory would not be much lower than it was in 2 days. Similarly, people who learned Spanish in high school or college forgot most of what they had learned, about 60% within 3 years, but very little more, only about 5% more through the next 50 years. Nice. Okay. He talks briefly about people who learn fast and people who learn slow. And some of you might have a concern that way. When I was young, I always was worried that I was learning slower than my peers. What turns out to happen is that the person who forgets the fastest, who do you think it is, the fast learner or the slow learner? Yeah, it's a trick question. The person who forgets the fastest is the one who knows it the least well. So if you want to remember things better, it doesn't matter whether you're a fast learner or a slow learner. That's good for some of us. What matters is how deeply you dive into that spring of knowledge. So if you learn something better, you will forget it more slowly. He next talks about pictures versus words. Information can be recorded either in visual form, pictures, scenes, faces, or in verbal form, words, numbers, names. For example, you can see in your mind's eye a visual image, a mental picture of a chair, or you can think of the word chair. And so he calls these an imagery process and a verbal process. And it turns out that imagery wins, just hands down. Imagery is much, much easier to remember than let's type that one down. That's kind of an important one. Images are remembered better than words. Okay, so visual process over a semantic process. verbal process, he calls it. And in general, concrete ideas are remembered better than abstract ones. And so what will we do, and you're learning this already in Lorraine's memory book when he talks about association and visualization, and he's had you been doing that. I hope you're doing his little exercises. If you can think of things, if you can make them more concrete, then you remember them better. And Higbee talks about this for a couple pages. He then spends several pages on exceptional memories, and I am going to assume, maybe unfairly, that none of you have an exceptional memory. And so it doesn't apply to us, and let's skip over it. It's not important to what we're trying to learn how to do. Then he has 2 or 3 pages on the very interesting ideas of sleep learning and subliminal learning. And the idea of sleep learning, I can remember when I was a boy, there would be these advertisements in the back of magazines or comic books even sometimes, where you could buy phonograph records. Yeah, that's how old I am. Phonograph records of foreign vocabulary, right? So if you wanted to learn Russian, you'd buy this record, and you put it on your phonograph just before you go to bed, and you move the arm over, right? So it repeats and repeats and repeats all night long, and you turn it down pretty low so it doesn't keep you awake. But then this woman's voice, she says, "Thank you, spasiba, hello, здравствуйте," and that's about all the Russian words I know. Friend, druk. I guess I know 3 words. And she would do this all night long, right? And the miracle was that in the morning, you wouldn't know any Russian because it doesn't work. No, it doesn't work at all. It turns out that sleeping after you learn something while you're awake does help you remember it. But no, there's just no evidence for it. And then what about subliminal learning? And you've all heard about this thing in the 50s where the movie theaters would splice, single frame photos of Coca-Cola or popcorn, right? So you're watching the movie and subliminally below the threshold of conscious perception, you would see these images and they would affect your subconscious. And then when they had the intermission, you would, let's go out to the snack bar and have a 7-Up. You would go out and buy this stuff. No one's been able to prove that works either. Yeah, it's a great story, but it's not true. It doesn't work. So let's go to chapter 4. And chapter 4 and chapter 5 are kind of the same. He split them up just because there's so much to cover. Chapter 4 is called How to Remember Almost Anything, Basic Principles. And then chapter 5 is called How to Remember Almost Anything Else, More Basic Principles. And so he's just divided these up kind of in a silly way, just so that the chapter doesn't feel too long. But let's just title this Basic Principles of memory, and I will say more than I will put on this whiteboard. I encourage you who are good note takers, we've had our unit on note taking already, to write down more than I'm actually typing myself. I would call that a minimum, but I'm going to be saying things that you might want to remember later. The first principle, the first basic principle of memory is meaningfulness. It's easier to remember stuff that has meaning. If stuff doesn't make sense, it's hard to learn. And if it's hard to learn, it's hard to remember. And we've already talked about words being easier to remember than nonsense syllables. Concrete words are easier to remember than abstract words. Words grouped into meaningful categories are easier to remember than words given in meaningless order. Sentences are easier to remember than words in ungrammatical order. And well-organized paragraphs and stories are easier to remember than disorganized ones. So meaningfulness affects memory, and he gives lots of examples. How can you make things meaningful then? Because some things, the first time you learn them, they aren't meaningful, right? This is the trouble. You're in a biology class and they try to teach you whatever, and how can you do it? It doesn't make sense. Or math class. I'm a math professor, and so I know how that goes. One way to make things meaningful is to make them more familiar. And so what this means is, well, study them more, take advantage of your own background, right? They've done experiments. This sounds very sexist to me, but this book is 20 or 30 years old in its earlier editions. Um, if a list of cooking terms and sports terms is given to a group of men and women, who's going to memorize the cooking terms faster and who's going to memorize the sports terms faster? Yeah, I don't want to say because I don't want to be a male chauvinist pig. um, yeah, familiarity is important. To meaningfulness, it's one way of creating meaningfulness. And part of familiarity means, well, just keep doing it, kids. You know, you study something and you think, oh man, this is hard. How can anyone learn this? Well, obviously someone did, or they couldn't have written the book. So spend some more time with it so that it does become familiar. You know, people like that, where you met them and you couldn't think of their name, and then you spend more time with them, they become familiar to them, and you can tell their not only their name, but their whole life story. Another way to create meaningfulness is to use rhymes. And I don't know if you know this one, I don't think they teach it anymore, but when did Christopher Columbus discover America? Yeah, and some people know and some people don't. Years and years ago, probably my mother learned it this way. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And it's a nice little rhyme, and it's mentioned in a lot of memory books. I'm not sure I've ever met a kid who ever heard it. I've not had students, so I don't know if it's a thing anymore. But years and years ago, you could use a rhyme like that. How about a spelling rhyme? Some of you know I before E except after C, or when sounded as A as in neighbor and way. And that's a little rhyme, and it helps with a tricky spelling conundrum. There is a rhyme, 30 days hath September, April, June, and November. I don't know if people use that very often anymore. I've had some kids who knew it. A lot of kids use the European method, right? So I'm holding up my hands. If you look at the thumbnail in the corner and you say January, February, March, you know. Anyway, how can you know how many days there are in each month? I learned it the rhyme way. And since then, I've learned the German way, and I think it's better, but I did learn the rhyme. There is a rhyme I know you learned, and it's a list of abstract nonsense syllables in no particular sensible order. And that's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. And it goes on like this. And if you say it to yourself a few times, you'll realize, oh, yeah, there's definitely a rhyme and there's a rhythm. Rhythm is related to rhyme. It helps cue you. Okay, Higby gives this example, and I've done it in the past. I'm going to type it over here. It's a 24-digit number, and I'm typing it out of the book. And what I've asked students to do, what Higby asks his readers to do, is look at this for 10 or 20 or 30 seconds and memorize it. And if you need a minute, well, look at it and memorize. And you're thinking, nope, nobody. I mean, this would be a very difficult memory task if you weren't totally trained in mnemonics. Unless, of course, you made this meaningful, right? Why is it difficult? Because it's meaningless. It's just a bunch of numbers. It's a bunch of digits. Higby says if you can find patterns, if you can find a pattern, rule, or underlying principle in what you have to remember, you will likely be able to learn it easier. And so in this one, and what I've always done in the past is I laboriously copy this number from the book as though it's an effort, right, to get it right. And I've done it so many times that I know how to do it. And then I close my eyes and I say 5, 8, 1, 2, 1, 5, 1, 9. Anyway, and I just go through the whole thing. And if you notice, I don't know if you do notice, but there's a pattern to it. There's a 5, and then you go to 8, and you think, yeah, I added 3. And then you go to 12, I added 4. 15, that's 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4. So if you know it starts with 5, and then you go 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4. And if you do it the way I did it and do it one digit at a time, if you don't say 5, 8, 12, 15, someone else is going to catch on and realize that you're pulling a fast one. But if you do it slowly and laboriously, and don't pause after each pair, but pause, 1, 9, 2, 2, right? And then people don't notice that there's this really obvious pattern to it. The use of patterns is not limited to memory for numbers, and he lists, he mentions a study found when paired associate word list had a pattern underlying the associations. The associations were remembered better. Chunking, you notice also chunking was taking place, and we talked about chunking in relation to short-term memory. Okay, the next basic principle of memory, I think there's 5 in this chapter and then 5 in the next, is organization. You can organize the material you have to learn, then it's easier to remember. And in class, what I typically do face-to-face is I ask if, and usually I pick a volunteer, right? I say, who wants to volunteer? And everyone avoids eye contact. You know, the students are all looking down at their desk at the floor. And so I pick someone and I say, okay, name the 50 states. And oh boy, some people, you know, they can't do it at all. They can, well, Idaho, yeah, and then they're kind of done. But usually I'll get one of 2 sorts of people. One type of student will say, okay, let me see, Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and you can see what I'm doing in my mind. If you see my eyes, I'm looking and I'm following the geography, right? I started up in the Northwest and I went down the coast, and then I did the next states in, and that works for a lot of people, you know, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. It's like, what have I done? I've organized these geographically. That would be one way to organize them. And then I get this other sort of student that just whips them all off just as quickly as they can. And the reason is, in the 4th grade, what did they do? They learned that song, right? There's a rhyme and there's rhythm. And someday I've got to learn that song for myself so I can do it. My 4th grade class, maybe the song hadn't been well, there were only 8. No, there weren't. Come on. That was in the 50s. How could I know all 50? There were only 48 when I was a boy. No, there weren't. Okay. Yeah, so he gives those examples. The important point is that your recall be organized, not haphazard. Similarly, you try to make a list of men's names that begin with the letter R. Your own memory is organized because you don't just start recalling random names. Fred, and you think, well, no, why would you think of Fred? That doesn't start with an R. Judy, no, they're supposed to be men's names. Your memory will pull them out, and you could make it even more organized by saying, how about names that start with R-A? Okay, Randy, I can think of. Ramses, yeah, that's a man's name. It's not very common nowadays, but you know, anyway, Rafi, there's a man's name. Then go to the REs, you know, Reginald, and it might help. Things are organized in memory, kind of like that. So in order to learn things better, arrange the order of material in a meaningful sentence, group it into similar categories, and they've done experiments. Here's one. You tell people, memorize these words: man, rose, dog, pansy, woman, horse, child, cat, carnation. This is a pretty difficult task, but if you say, hey, there's people, man, woman, child, there's animals, dog, cat, horse, there's flowers, rose, pansy, carnation, well then, yeah, it's a lot easier. You can use organization to make material meaningful, right? And then we're getting this earlier principle. And he gives lots of examples. The serial position effect. This is an important thing. Let's mention this. So the serial position, click, okay. The serial position effect tells us that things we learn first or last are remembered better, and things in the middle worse. So if you have a list of 20 things you want to learn, and I read you the list of 20 things, you study it a little bit, The first two or three you will remember better. The last two or three you will remember better. The ones in the middle you won't remember as well. And this has direct implications to your studying, right? If you're studying for 3 different classes and you've got assignments or tests, quizzes coming up tomorrow, then the things that are harder, the things that you do have the quiz over, you want to study first and you want to study those last. And it also means sometimes you don't have much of a choice. It's, no, I have 3 quizzes and I have 3 classes. Well, make sure that the thing you study in the middle gets more attention. It gets more time and more effort. The next basic principle of memory, and you know all about this one because you've been reading Harry Lorraine's Page-a-Minute Memory book, and that's association. If something reminds us of what we're trying to remember, then it helps. Higby gives the example. Draw a map of Denmark, and you think, what? What? I kind of know about Denmark. I'm not sure I could do it in any way that would satisfy a Dane. But if I said, draw a map of Italy, you say, oh yeah, it looks like a boot, and you draw it, and it kind of looks like Italy does. Because of the association, you've made an association between Italy's shape, which is a very abstract, random sort of thing, and a boot, which is, yeah, that's very concrete. So he gives lots of examples of association. I don't think I need to go over them very well because you've been doing it in the other book. Think around it. This is something I've mentioned sort of in passing. So think around it. We do associate things. This is the way our mind works. And I'll read his paragraph. Suppose, for example, you're trying to think of the name of that favorite teacher you had in school many years ago. You can't think of her name. You might try thinking of the classroom itself, where you sat, what she looked like, the names of other students in the class, the names of other teachers you had that year. One of these other items might have become associated with your favorite teacher's name enough to bring it out. And you can do this on a test, right? You're having a test and it's over Abraham Lincoln and they ask some question, you think, I don't remember that. Well, think of everything you know about Abraham Lincoln. Oh, he was born in a log cabin in Kentucky, and then he moved to Illinois. He was a lawyer. He used to ride a horse. He read Euclid's Elements at night by candlelight. He was president. Oh, he was shot. Ford's Theater. Yeah, John Wilkes. And I'm just kind of doing a dump of my memory, and something will remind me of what I'm trying to remember about him. And you think, yeah, but I don't know all those things about Abraham Lincoln. Well, which ones do you know? Oh, he's, yeah. Next, visualization. And we know the importance of this. We've just mentioned that visual things are more easily remembered than verbal things. And so take advantage of visualization. Concrete words and sentences are almost always learned faster and remembered better than abstract words. There's tons of research on this. The more vivid you can make your visualization, the better. Not only does it make learning more effective, it makes learning more fun, right? Because you can make up these pictures. This fifth one is very, very important. Attention. He quotes Oliver Wendell Holmes. A man must get a thing before he can forget it. And remember, there's a memory process, right? We learned the 3 processes, acquisition, encoding, and then storage, and then retrieval. And the failure of any one of them will cause forgetting. And typically attention is one that's to blame for a lot of stuff. You know, you're at a party and they say, hey, this is, and they introduce you to 3 different people, and 2 minutes later you're talking to the person, you realize, I don't have any idea who this is. What's this person's name? And the reason is you kind of didn't pay attention right at the beginning. He gives some examples of things we don't pay attention to. Which color is on top of a stoplight? You know, who has to know that? We've seen how many stoplights every single day of our lives, and you'd be surprised how many people can't do this. Can't answer that question. Whose image is on a penny? Well, come on, it was Abraham Lincoln. We were just talking about him. Is he wearing a tie? And it's like, wait, what? Oh, what? Yeah, how many times have you had a penny in your hand? Thousands of times you've had a penny in your hand. And you never looked, right? You never paid attention. You never noticed. And so how would you know? He gives some other examples. I don't think they're very good examples, so I'm not going to read them to you. So attention is the last of the basic principles discussed in this chapter, but is certainly not the least. In fact, none of the other principles can be applied if attention is not. You can't make material meaningful. You can't organize it. You can't associate it. You can't visualize it if you don't get it in the first place. So there are some basic principles of memory. That ends chapter 4. And then he goes on to chapter 5, how to remember almost anything else, more basic principles. And there are, again, 5 of these. I'm not going to put up a new page. I'm going to just continue right here. And if we need more room, and I think we will, then we'll erase it when we get to it. So the next one is repetition. Almost everyone knows the importance of repetition. Some things you can learn, you hear them once and you got it. And most things you need to hear it more than once. And so repetition is important. Repetition, what he says, I like this, the way he words it. It's necessary, not sufficient. It's not enough that you repeated it 10 times. It'd be great if it were. He gives the story of the little boy, right? Second grader, and he wrote a paper for his teacher. And this is the days when kids were punished for doing things wrong. I don't think that happens anymore. But he wrote, "I have went" on the paper. I had a friend back when I was in the publishing business. My best friend, it wasn't my friend, it was his wife. And she didn't know what a past participle was, you know, so she would say, "I have went," and "I have saw," and "I have did," you know, and this was just the way she talked. It was the way her parents talked, evidently, and how she was brought up, and they never trained her in high school. But the story goes that this little boy writes, "I have went" in a paper, and so the teacher makes him stay after school. And 100 times he has to write on the board, right? I don't know if they do this anymore except on the Bart Simpson introduction. But he has to write, "I have gone, I have gone, I have gone." And he does this 100 times. And halfway through it, she says, "You know, I've got a faculty meeting I have to go to, so I'm going to leave, but you keep doing this. And when you've done your 100, then you can leave." And the kid writes, "I have gone, I have gone, I have gone." And at the very end, he says, "I finished doing this, so I have went." Yeah, but bump. And he gives some other examples. What about continued repetition after you learn things? So let's mention this. Continued repetition after you have learned something called overlearning. And this is very, very powerful. If any of you have been in the service, then you know that in military and boot camp, this is one of their main methods of teaching things like, you know, rifle skills, overlearning. Do it. You got it? Good. Do it again. You got it? Do it again with the lights off. You know what? You got it? Do it again, faster. And overlearning is very, very valuable. Notice that overlearning doesn't mean cramming for an exam, right? We'll mention this. Cramming has no repetition. Cramming never works. It just doesn't. And we'll see why in a second. You remember, I mean, some of you because it was last year, but you remember the names of people in your high school class. Well, because you saw them every day for 4 years and you overlearned. Here's this next one. This is important. Relaxation. And the idea here is that memory does have what a psychologist would call affective component. Affective component means it's affected by your mood. And in particular, if you are anxious, your memory powers go out the window. And you've all had this experience where you're taking a test and it's kind of a high stakes test. It's important to your grade and you're a little bit nervous. And you look at that first question, you think, oh, shoot, I know this, and you can't think of it. And now you're even more nervous, and so you don't know the next question or the next or the next, and you blow the entire exam, not because you didn't study, not because you don't know the stuff, but just because you are nervous. And this is a true thing. This is one reason that cramming doesn't work, because the anxiety you have during the test is going to kind of fight over whatever you did with the cramming. You didn't have any repetition. And so you didn't actually learn the stuff. I had, let me give you an example. I had this student, and you could try this yourself. I had a student 3 years ago. She was in my algebra class. She was a non-trad, right? She was a non-traditional student. And I love having non-traditional students in all of my classes because they add so much to the mix. And this lady, she was in her 40s, and she was also from Eastern Europe, right? And so she was a very interesting woman. Spoke with an accent and always asked good questions. She sat in the very front row of my class, right? She was that kind of determined, distinguished, no, principled. This is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Diligent. I knew it started with the D, right? We store words in different ways, and I had the D part. She was a very diligent student. She applied herself. She worked very hard, spent a lot of time on homework, always did it on time, got in a study group, all the things she should do. And she came to my office once and said, Professor Thomas, I'm studying and I'm learning the things and I'm able to do the homework and I have a very good grade on homework. And I knew she did. She says, but I get in the test and I get so nervous, I just forget everything. And I said, well, yeah, of course you do. And she's like, what? I said, that's how memory works. If you get nervous, you forget stuff. So don't feel bad about it. Well, that, of course, is no help. So I went on and said, here's what we do. And we'll practice it right here in my office. You're sitting right in the front row, and I'm sitting right there watching everybody take the test. When you get nervous, look up at me, and I'll make eye contact. I'll see you looking. And what we'll do, and we did it, I said, we'll breathe like this. Breathe in. And I did this really obvious, my shoulders go up, my chest goes out, and you can just see that I'm breathing. It's very visual for her. I say, you breathe in, and then hold the breath for a bit, and then let out. And I said, I promise you this will calm down, and we'll do it twice if you need. Hold it, let out. And so the next test, a few evenings later, we're sitting there and I'm looking around the room and she looks up at me and her eyes are wide and she has the deer in the headlights look, Math is just about to run her down and I look at her and I nod and give her a nice, smile, calming smile, and I do that thing and I can see her doing it. And we hold it and she lets out and we do it a second time and then she nods at me. She has kind of a half smile on her face and she looks back down at her paper and she keeps going. And it worked. It worked for her. And well, what if I'm not there? Well, come on, kids, you know how to breathe, right? You can do it. You can say, oh man, I'm forgetting everything. Oh yeah. Gary said it would be like this. That's all right. I'm going to breathe for 30 seconds and it'll come back to me. And then it will. Try it. Okay, another principle of memory, and this one also has direct applications to what you have to do as a college student, and that's context. What you learn or how you learn, well, that's these other things, right? Meaningfulness, it's what you learn, how you learn. Organization, how you learn. Association, visualization, things like this. Context is where you learn. And it turns out that if you learn something in a particular place, you remember it better in that place. Context does matter. Contextual cues help recall. And there's all kinds of research, and Higby goes on for several pages here. One thing you can do is practice where you have to perform. And if you think of a theater group, right, they always do their dress rehearsal on the actual stage. The rehearsals, I've been in some theater things, used to be in Boise Music Week. And I can remember when we did 42nd Street, there's 40 tap dancers. And there's a dog food company. It's an old warehouse out east of town. Used to be a dog food company. And we would go in there, and they had this special wooden floor they'd put over the concrete. And these 40 gals, it was the loudest thing you've ever heard. And we practiced there for months. And then the week before the actual performance, we were at the Morrison Center practicing on the actual stage, because context makes a difference. Practice where you have to perform. And you can do that, right? I'm applying this to you as students. You can do that by practicing recall. Um, in a sense, you're already doing that, right? You're sitting in class every day, and maybe not right now, but a typical class, you're in 1318 in APIN. That's where my algebra class usually is. And the kids are there every Tuesday and Thursday. But there are situations where you might not be. The example I can give from my own experience, when I was in grad school in Canada, they're a little different the way they do their final exams. They do the final exams in the gym, and they do them at a certain time. And if you have a final at a certain time, then you go to the gym at that time, and they have 300 or 400 chairs and desks, set up on the gym floor. It's a pretty funny thing to see. And there are all these proctors, right, walking up and down the aisles and looking and watching you. So there's some stress, there's some relaxation that would be valuable. Anyway, I knew that my final exam would be in this unusual place, and I knew something about memory. And so a month before the final, I knew that the final was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What I started doing is going to the gym every day at 2 o'clock. I would take my textbook and my notebook, and I would work on assignments. I would study stuff, and I would practice recalling stuff. And I would study in that location. I couldn't actually go down on the gym floor. That would have been perfect. Why? Because they were playing basketball. But I could sit as close as I could in the bleachers, first or second row. And I got used to the place. I mean, it had a certain smell, it had a certain ambiance, and the way the sun came in through the windows at 2 o'clock, and there was a big heater up in the corner hanging from the ceiling, and every once in a while it would go and blow out warm air. And I got very, very used to it. And then the day of the exam, I show up at 2 o'clock, I sit down in my chair, and halfway through the exam, there's this and it's almost like a memory cue. You remember when it did this and you were studying? Yeah, and it's like, okay, I was very, very used to the place. So if that first strategy is not possible, that is practice where you will perform. Well, practice that's similar, and this was me. I practiced on the first or second row. I couldn't be actually on the floor. Use the context effect while you're taking the exam. So you're trying to remember what you studied. Well, you've been studying at the kitchen table. You can close your eyes for a split second and think of the kitchen table and picture the kitchen and how the window there is and what the table looks like, and there's the stove and the fridge. And this helps you contextually. When you are practicing, suppose you have to make a speech, right? You're going to make a speech somewhere. You can practice the speech and imagine in your mind, you can see where you are going to perform the speech, and that will also help. There's footnotes in Higbee's book. And then here's the fourth one. This is kind of interesting. You can immunize against contextual changes. And the idea here is, well, do the opposite. So you learn best, you remember best where you learned it. Well, so learn it everywhere, and then you can remember it everywhere. So you immunize yourself. Don't study just at your kitchen table. Study sometimes in the library, and sometimes in the classroom, and sometimes in the atrium area, and sometimes in your car, and sometimes lots of different places. So there are 4 ways you can use the context effect. You do have to study, right? Sometimes context affects whether you are able to study, right? If you're in a situation where there's just too many distractions, right? The TV's going or whatever, well, go somewhere else. Don't cheat yourself out of that. The next one, can I fit one more in here before I erase the screen and start over? This is interest. It's easier to remember stuff that you're interested in, than stuff you're not. And he goes on for pages and pages with lots of examples of why this works, and proof that it works. What do I want to say here? What I want to say is the difficulty for students is sometimes you're taking a class and the stuff in the class is just really boring. And I don't have to name, I don't want to insult any particular person, because if I said like sociology, well, someone's going to say, no, sociology, that's my major. That's actually interesting. The boring stuff, well, that's chemistry. And then along comes the engineering student. He says, no, chemistry is cool because like there's chemicals and reactions and stuff. The boring stuff, that's like Shakespeare. And then of course the English student says, oh, Shakespeare just transports me to heights of ecstasy. I love Shakespeare. Don't be saying bad stuff about Shakespeare. It's really math that's boring. And crickets, right? Hey, wait, you guys, no, someone has to like math. Well, I had this professor once, Gary, he liked math. Yeah, math is kind of interesting. But anyway, there's always stuff that you are not interested in, and there's always stuff that you are interested in. And the way to take advantage of this basic principle of memory is to become interested in it, make some connections. And I can tell you as a math teacher, the notorious question, Professor Thomas, when will we ever use this? That doesn't really fly with me. I don't think it's a good question. I have a particular way of answering it. Take one of my math classes someday and ask me, and I'll show you what I do. But anyway, you can create interest, and the math books try to do that nowadays, right? It's not to the students' liking because they give you a bunch of abstract principles, and here's how you solve this equation, and well, we should make it interesting for the students. And what does that mean for math? It means story problems. Judy has a store where she sells mixed nuts, and if she has 3 ounces of peanuts, and supposedly this is supposed to make it interesting, I guess if you're really a nutty person, maybe it is, but um, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Don't rely on the textbook, rely on yourself. Ask yourself, well, how can I make this interesting? What's the cool part about it? You're in a biology class and you're studying all these things and you think, well, what does this have to do with me? And do ask yourself those questions. What's the whole point of this class? It's called connecting with ideas. And so, yeah, connect with them and you will thank me later. Interest is one possible reason why some adults, especially the elderly, may find it hard to learn and remember new information. That's kind of my dad. He's very interested in stuff that has happened in the past. He's interested in stuff that's happening recently. Okay, we've got one more memory principle here in chapter 5, and that's feedback. Feedback is really, really important because it tells you what you are learning. For one thing, going back to interest, well, it keeps you interested, right? If you have some feedback, then it keeps you interested. If you study and study and study and study and you don't know, am I actually making any progress? Am I learning this? It becomes less interesting. First grade children, here's a research study that Higbee mentions. First grade children were taught to rehearse material to help them remember it. And so what's this? This is our principle of repetition. So practice the material, say it over and over. Some were given feedback on how well it worked, others were not. When later given the option of rehearsing, only those who had received feedback on its value persisted in using it. And the second part about feedback is you will be able to make adjustments to improve. You get feedback and you realize, oh, wait, this thing I thought I knew, I don't. Well, I should study it more. Wait, this thing I'm studying so hard, I already know it well. I'm going to study it less. So feedback really, really does help. All righty. We're in chapter 6, and let's talk about study skills. So this is his next chapter. Strategies for effective learning. And you think to yourself, well, yeah, memory should be a valuable part. So this is a reasonable topic. So first principle is reduce interference. So you remember back from a few weeks ago, interference was one of the 5 causes of forgetting. And interference is the situation where something you learn now makes you forget something you learned earlier, or something you learn now makes it more difficult to learn something in the future. So there's proactive and reactive. We had those vocabulary words for those 2 kinds of interference. And how can you reduce interference? Well, one way is to learn the material well. If you know the material really, really well, then you won't mix it up. Second way to reduce interference, make the material meaningful. And you're noticing, you're noticing that's not how you spell meaningful. You know, I think there's a way for me to edit. Once I figured it out. I don't know if I did. I'm curious if I can. Nope. I did it once. Someone told me. Well, anyway, there's only one L in meaningful. If you're seeing 2, I would suggest going to the eye doctor. Yeah, I went to the eye doctor a few weeks ago. My eyes are just about the same as they were last time. He said, well, get an extra pair anyway. You got inch. I thought, what? And I went home, told my wife. The doctor said, she said, well, yeah. Oh, okay. I guess I could lose these or break them, or maybe I need a new style, right? You know, just looking at me, you can tell I'm a guy who cares about style. No, my dad and I used to fight about that all the time. What I just do, make the material meaningful. The third principle of seeing interference, and we'll have 2 or 3 things we'll have to say about this, is watch out for intervening activity. And what I mean by watch out is, well, sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not. So what happens between the time you learn and the time you are supposed to recall? That's the intervening activity. And there's how long does it take and what do you do? Generally, the more you do, the more opportunity there is for interference to occur. And he gives this example. So one student studied for an exam, then went to a movie, read the newspaper, read a magazine, studied another subject, and then took the exam. Second student, he studied for the exam, and then he went to sleep, and the next morning took the exam. So all other things being equal, there's more interference for the first student than for the second. Minimum interference should occur if you sleep between studying and testing, and Higbee, ever the joker, says, assuming you studied well and are not sleeping instead of studying, there is research evidence that a person who goes to sleep right after learning will remember more than a person who stays awake, because there are things that your brain does. These aren't well understood, actually. Maybe one of you kids will become a psychologist or a neurologist and figure this out in the future. But there is something happens. We know the effect is there, and we don't know exactly why, but there's something that the brain does while you're asleep that reorganizes memories and helps you remember things. So watch out for intervening activity. This is the amount, right? Amount. Minimize it. The type of activity. You don't want it to be similar. And I always give the example of someone who's studying Spanish and Portuguese. If you're studying Spanish in the morning and Portuguese in the afternoon, I tell you, it isn't going to work. The languages are so similar, you will mix them up all the time. The best type of intervening activity, of course, is sleep, because it's totally dissimilar. That's the best kind. If you cannot sleep all the time after study, well, yeah, right, I can't. What, you're taking a class at 10 in the morning, and as soon as we're done, you should all take a nap. You're thinking, what? No, you can't do that. Sometimes it's not possible. Well, then do something really different from this. And in a way, your college classes do that, right? You have a morning class and it's on Shakespeare, and then you have a early afternoon, it's on math, and then you have a later afternoon and it's history. Well, those are different enough, if your professor's not real good at connecting ideas, that you don't mix them up too much. Even better would be if you're having to do Spanish and Portuguese, falling back on my example, take your Spanish class Monday and Tuesday, and then take your Portuguese class Thursday and Friday, or Friday and Saturday, whatever it is, so that you have some block of time and then a big gap and then another. There's a limit to how that can be done. They asked me to teach the linear algebra class in the spring, and I said, I don't want to do it. And the chair asked me, she said, why not? And I said, well, for one thing, it's a Friday afternoon, and I don't want to have a whole week and then I have to do Friday afternoon. Move it to a different day and maybe it. And the other thing is it's a 3-hour class. Well, that's what it should be, right? It's a 3-credit class, should be 3 hours. Yeah, but I talk for an hour and the kids' brains are full. And I want to build on stuff. Math is kind of that way. And I can't teach them anymore. And so it's really, really difficult. We all struggle with it. I said, if you make it 2 or 3 days a week and it's not on a Friday, then yeah, I'll teach it. It's a fun class to teach. Fabulous class. The next one is how to reduce interference. Use different learning contexts. So if you have to take Spanish and Portuguese at the same time in the same semester, when you study your Spanish, do it at your kitchen table. And when you have to study your Portuguese, do it at the desk in your bedroom. And the different contexts will help you. You get to a test and it's over Spanish and you can close your eyes for a second and see yourself in the kitchen, sitting there at the chair. And when you're doing the Portuguese, same thing. Imagine yourself in your bedroom at your desk. I mean, you could do all kinds of silly things. If you're practicing Spanish vocabulary, always write it at the top page. And if you're practicing Portuguese vocabulary, always do it at the bottom of the page. Yeah. You could use different colored paper, maybe different colored inks. Higby doesn't mention that. He mentions the page thing. How else can you reduce interference? Kind of talked about this one. I'm not sure I have to say a lot more. I already said it. And then here's another study skill. This is a big, big, big study skill. This is an important one. Space it out. Your studying has to be spread out, right? For one thing, what was our basic principle? Our basic principle of repetition. It's necessary. Well, you can't repeat everything in 1 hour. Space it out means no cramming. No cramming. Cramming doesn't work. It's a waste of your time, right? You think, well, I don't like studying. Well, don't cram then, because not only are you studying, but you're spending time doing something you don't enjoy for no actual value. And he has all these quotations and study reports. Spacing out benefits reviewing. Yeah, anyway. Here are 3 reasons why spacing it out is better. One reason is you can concentrate only so long. This is the one I just mentioned. Your brain gets full. You get tired. I mean, seriously, you do. Second, there's evidence that what you have learned during a study session may consolidate in your mind during a break. And so it is good to take breaks. And the best break, of course, we've mentioned this one a couple times today, is sleep. And the third reason that spacing it out helps is if you space out, you're probably learning in different contexts. Because you're not in the same place, you're somewhere else because it's a different time later on. Spaced learning reduces the amount of actual study time it takes to learn the material. So I always tell my students when they're studying their math, doing a half hour a day is way better than doing 6 hours a day on Sunday, 6 hours a week on Sunday. And you think, well, a half hour a day, that's like 3.5 hours. Yeah, 3.5 hours spread out, you learn more than you will learn 6 hours all at once. This next one, break it up. And he has a question mark on this, which is funny for a section heading. Break it up. The thing is, there's a whole method. And there's a part method. And I'm not going to type this in, but you might write it in your notes so that you know the difference between these. The idea of the whole method, he says the part method first. The idea of the part method is you break up the material into smaller parts, and then you study each part. So each section or each verse or each paragraph, each stanza, whatever it is. Gesundheit. Separately, you study the first part until you've learned it. And then you study the second part until you've learned it. And then you study the third part, and so on. It keeps going like that. In the whole method, you study the whole thing from beginning to end. All the parts together. And then when you get to the end, start at the beginning and study the whole thing to the end. And then what do you have to do? Repetition, we know. Study it again over and over and over. And Higby says, well, sometimes you should do the one and sometimes you should do the other. The question is, well, which? And so he has 7 criteria, 7 conditions. The whole method is better, if I can put this here. The whole method gives a context of meaning. And we know that meaningfulness is one of the basic principles of memory. If you can make things meaningful. Well, if you're only learning a little tiny part, it's not as meaningful as if you learn the whole thing. And so the whole method is better. Gives you an overall picture of how the parts fit together. This overview helps you remember the material. Learning the parts without having an overall picture is like putting a jigsaw puzzle together without looking at the box, right? In the part method, putting the parts together will take up as much as half of the total learning time, right? You learn each part, and then you put the parts together. Well, that takes half of your time, and that's where you'll have most of the errors. And so the whole method is obviously better. Yeah, but wait. The part method is better because it gives feedback on the learning, right? You know immediately if you know it. He gives an example. Suppose it takes a person an hour to memorize a passage of 500 words. Suppose that a 100-word portion of this passage requires only 9 minutes to memorize. Well, after 9 minutes, you know 100 words of it, and you can say those 100 words, and this encourages you. It gives you feedback. It makes you feel good. You are making progress. It's not just a long slog. It's less discouraging than here you've read through the 500 words and read through them twice and read through them, and you're getting tired of it because you haven't learned anything yet, and it's going to take you, what, an hour. The whole method, one advantage is if you practice the whole method a lot, you will get better at the whole method. And if you practice the part method a lot, you won't get better at the part method. The whole method actually does get better over time. The part method, though, the more material there is, the better the part method is. And he lists some numbers. I don't need to read them to you. The more distinctive the parts are, the better the part method is. This 6th one, here's the whole thing. Here's one sentence. The advantages of the whole method are greater for distributed learning than for mass learning. I don't know exactly what that means. I'm thinking it's related to space it out. Since I don't understand it, I usually don't even list it. Um, the whole method, the more mature and intelligent the learner is, the better the whole method works. So that might encourage some of you. Oh, well, I'm definitely mature and intelligent, so I'm going to use the whole method. And then some of you might be more realistic. Well, maybe not. You know, I'm this age and I know this much stuff. I would say try them both, right? That's the principle of this whole class is I give you lots of things. When we did our note-taking unit, I gave you 5 or 6 ways to take notes, and I said, try them, see what works, and what works, keep doing that. Time management, same thing. Here's a bunch of ways to do time management. Well, try them all, and what works, keep doing that. And so I would say, try both of these. Higby says you probably want to combine them for almost everything. So, for example, you might study by the whole method, but select certain parts for extra study. There's this clever compromise he has. It's called the whole part whole. First, go through the whole thing once or twice, and then break it up into logical parts and learn them, and then review as a whole. And this method, he says, can be very effective for long, difficult material, and there's a footnote, of course. Then there's this progressive part method, and students, this works really, really well for certain things. I use it sometimes for poetry. Yeah, I like to memorize poetry. You probably thought that when you first saw me, right? Oh yeah, he looks like a guy. Yeah, I like to memorize poetry. Um, here's the progressive part method. I'm gonna put it down here. Compromise, uh, whole, part whole. We just talked about that. And then this last thing is called the progressive part method. And it works not only for poetry, but for lots of things. You learn the first part. And what does that entail? It entails using the principles of memory, maybe using a mnemonic, right? Probably involves some repetition. And now you know the first part, whatever it is. And so for poetry, maybe it's one line of poetry. And you read it and you cover it over with your hand and you try to say it and you get 2 words. And so you read it again and you organize it, you make it meaningful, you connect it with things. You pay attention to it. You notice stuff about it. Oh, there's some alliteration here. Oh, there's a clever internal rhyme. Oh, this word is unusual, right? You're doing all these things and you learn the first part and then you learn the second part. So you go to the second line and you read it and you try it and no, you don't know it. And you try it again and again you notice stuff and you make it meaningful and you organize it. And once you've learned that second part, then practice the first and second part. Right? So it's a progressive part. So you're doing the first line and the second line together as a unit. And it might take you more than one try, right? Because you're having to connect these things, organize them in a way. Well, now do the third part and memorize that. And now do the first, second, third together. And then do the fourth part. So there's this progressive part method. And it has an advantage over the whole method in that you get feedback. You realize that you are really learning something. It's particularly helpful for older adults because forgetting takes place during learning, and because many elderly people, not me, but you know, really old people, since they need more trials than young adults do to learn something, they're likely to forget more while they're learning large amounts of material. The progressive part method may reduce this effect. We've got one more study skill. Do we have one more? Yes, we have one more. I'm going to mention it and then we will, I think I'm out of time. And so this is called Recite It. It doesn't mean reciting in your second grade class. So someone's in charge of remembering this when we get together in a week for our next class. Whoever's in charge, you know who you are. when I say, where were we? You will say, you were just about to talk about Recite It. So this is very, very important. Actually, of all of these study skills, I think this is my favorite. I think if you don't do any of these but one, I would choose this one. And we'll talk about why. So I will tell you all, have a good week. You got plenty to do. Holler if you need anything from me. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you on Tuesday.